Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Hyperledger Global Forum 2021. We're here at the start of day two for segment one, which is the segment for Asia Pacific and European audiences. We have a terrific set of keynote conversations and presentations and one really cool fireside chat coming on, a couple of them actually, now that I think of it. So let me just get the day started with a little bit of housekeeping and a little bit of framing for some cool things that are happening in the Hyperledger community. First, why don't we jump in? Of course, Hyperledger Global Forum has been helped and assisted with very generous sponsorship from our sponsors. So I can't help but mention them right now. Accenture and IBM as diamond sponsors, of course, as well as Filecoin Foundation, Hitachi, Siemens, and Zuellig Pharma as our platinum sponsors. Their support has really made so much of this possible. So thank you so much for this. Also, a key thing, Hyperledger Global Forum, like all Linux Foundation events, are governed by a code of conduct. That's published on the website for you all to read as a part of Hopin. This is a collaborative community. This is one where there'll be lots of engagement between us. We trust that everyone has read this and understands if they ever feel uncomfortable, they can always come to us and talk, because we really believe very strongly we need to create a culture and an environment where everyone feels welcome. Truly all are welcome here. And so the code of conduct is a key part of that. So I appreciate everyone's attention on that. Just to set the ground a little bit before we jump in, Hyperledger has always been an international effort. I've been, until this year, on a plane, probably 65% of the last 5 years, traveling around to help talk to the world about Hyperledger. And we've accomplished a lot in those 5 years. We have an amazing array of projects you heard about, so many of them from Arno yesterday. But really, the coolest stats are the ones that really speak to our global footprint out there. We have 175 different meetup communities that are represented in over 75 different countries. And many of them got very active during the pandemic in taking what were previously face-to-face conversations, putting them online. And suddenly I found myself and many of our community members presenting at the Sao Paulo meetup community, or to the Tokyo meetup community 1 hour later, right? I'm not sure I'll ever get on a plane again, actually. It's pretty addictive and pretty fun to be able to do that. So that footprint has grown, and you heard about the technology releases again in Arno's presentation yesterday, so I won't go into that, but those communities have been alive and putting out new code. Another real source of this has been the labs. A lot of new labs have come in the last few months and really this year, showing that there's this innovation going on the ground. Lots of ideas, lots of people putting pieces together, and some major contributions as well have come in the last few days. You've heard about much of that here at the event. But let's talk really about this international footprint. These different, in fact, this year alone, there's been 60 different virtual meetups taking place since the beginning of the year. All right, and this has been a chance for people to get to know each other face to face and understand what's really at the heart of our community. So we've also been busy launching some regional chapters. In fact, just this year we launched chapters, which are basically collections of meetup communities in Latin America, in Italy, because we've been active in all sorts of cities in Italy. The India community really rallied together. Both the schools and the companies headquartered in India got together and created quite an amazing array of not only meetups and content, but also starting to channel their community into contributions into the projects. And also just recently launched the Hyperledger Africa chapter as well, really giving us this really rich representation in the global south that we're really happy to see happen. We also announced just last week the formation of the Hyperledger Japan chapter. Japan has long been an important market for Hyperledger technologies. Many of our core governing board members are headquartered, and many of the companies are headquartered in Japan. And we've been really eager to see and happy to see the community grow there. So with this, we think there'll be an even better position we'll be in an even better position as society reopens to be able to help take advantage of the community that's there and the real use cases that we see emerging from that part of the world. We also have long had a very active community in China. Many of you have heard about that community. Actually, last December, they were the first meetup to meet again face to face. These are photos from the Hyperledger Beijing meetup group. And we have a very active WeChat presence. If any of you are calling in from China, welcome, and really glad that you can be here. As I mentioned yesterday, 6 of the sessions, actually 7 of them, 7 of the sessions here at Hyperledger Global Forum are in Chinese, and we want to do everything to make sure you feel like a first-class member of the community, because there's so much good engineering work, so much good development work coming out of China, and obviously lots and lots of deployments out there as well. This year has also been a really a time when we've really invested in getting internationalization into the heart of the projects, helping them be not strictly just English language. So in addition to the 13 different languages that we've seen meetups hosted in, we drove a contribution campaign in Hyperledger Fabric around the Fabric documentation that resulted in 8 new languages being supported in the core documentation for Fabric and kept up to date with Fabric releases. This is really remarkable, and it was only possible through the help of a tremendous number of volunteers who organized their efforts, who chose tools to help synchronize that work, and have really gone above and beyond to make that possible. We've also seen translations of the Hyperledger homepage itself, so that adapt naturally when you've set your language preference in the browser, again, to make it feel like a welcome place for people who speak all of the world's other major languages. And then we've also seen the Hyperledger Fabric training course translated into Spanish as well, the online course that we have for that. So some really fun things there. Also, beyond the code, many of you know we have these special interest groups. These special interest groups have long been a part of Hyperledger. I think the first one we started was the healthcare special interest group back in the first year we were in existence, out of a sense of intuition that the healthcare community and the blockchain community had very little overlap between them, and we needed to find some way to bridge that gap and talk about the use cases, talk about the limits of the technology as much about the potential. Since that time, we've broadened out into telecom, into capital markets and trade finance, into all sort of domains, including one that we're going to talk about next, which is the climate actions and accounting special interest group. So stay tuned for that. We also believe education is a really huge part of growing the community beyond the code. We've had free courses distributed through edX around Fabric and Sawtooth, as well as Hyperledger Indy and Aries for quite some time, and as well as an exam and certification course around Fabric and Sawtooth. We've updated the courses for Fabric, and we've also now released new free content for the Hyperledger Besu Essentials. And that's the first time we've done this for Besu. We anticipate doing a lot more. We're working on a certification and exam process for Besu as well to help grow that community and help people who have those skills be able to market themselves and go get some awesome jobs in this domain. Because again, this has got to be about building these layers beyond the core developers so that we get more people using it and get more traction. Sorry, I forgot to advance the slides. So there's the slide on the training materials. We also have a vendor ecosystem that has grown this year to over 24 different Hyperledger certified service providers. These are organizations who employ staff who have passed these different courses, and we can attest then to the fact that they kind of know what they're doing. So they range from large companies with familiar names all the way to startups all over the world. If your organization would like to be listed there, please get in touch and we'll talk with you about the criteria for being listed. But this is a very short list to be able to turn to when you want to be able to, when you need a blockchain network built and you're not sure who to work with to get something like that done. This is an important part of everything we do. Finally, if any of you have been asking, how do I get involved more in the technologies and the software projects themselves, we have a very rich set of project demos that we've been doing on the side of the other breakout sessions Please come to many of those. Those are being presented by core maintainers on those projects. And the ones coming up today and tomorrow include Fabric and Indy and Bezu and Ursa. There's also tomorrow a conversation amongst the Hyperledger Cactus core contributors as well about where that project is heading. Please come to any of these. And if you're interested in the translation efforts, there's a panel particularly on that tomorrow in segment 2 called The Tower of Babel, a panel for translations in Latin America, Africa, and Europe. This is just core to who we are. So hopefully this gives you a flavor of that international footprint. Very quickly, we have an exciting set of keynotes, both in this segment happening in the next hour and a half and in the one in about 8 hours, I think the timing is, happening for Europe and the United States. That includes a panel on discussing the application of distributed ledger technology in climate. I'll make an introduction to those panelists very soon. It includes in a fireside chat I'll be having with Vitalik Buterin, which I think will be really fun. Following that, we'll have a conversation about reopening air travel using verifiable credentials, using some of the technologies we've built here at Hyperledger to make that possible. And that'll be with Marie Massery from IATA and Drummond Reed from Evernym. And then in segment 2, we're going to hear from the Hyperledger Governing Board Chair, Rob Palatnik, who has been one of the biggest champions for the use of this technology for core financial infrastructure. And I think he's going to give his kind of view from the top of where the industry is heading and why this is still such an important thing to get right. Following him will be Karim Youssef from IBM. Karim is the new head honcho when it comes to all things blockchain at IBM. And he has some exciting announcements planned for his keynote. So be sure and catch that. And finally, I will hear from Mary Lasserty, who's a professor in supply chain at the University of Alabama, who'll be talking about her research in what are the ways that this technology has been used to really deliver value. Don't forget, we have a virtual hallway track in Gathertown that we'd love to see many of you there in between sessions, during breaks, even after the sessions end for the day. And during the breaks in between, you can also get to know other people here at Hyperledger Global Forum in our networking tab. It's a randomized way to be able to meet somebody else here, and it's really kind of fun. I've met quite a few new people through that already. And then don't forget to visit the Kiva booth. It's hard to do attendee gifts for a virtual event because shipping things around the world is not only expensive to do, it's bad for the environment. But what we've partnered with on Kiva is to give you a credit that you can use to make microloans in Kiva system as a recognition of the role that they're playing in driving the adoption of self-sovereign ID and distributed ledger technology worldwide through the Kiva protocol, which is a really awesome thing. So be sure and visit them. And links to everything on that is in Hopin. So with that, I'd like to transition now actually to our first panel. So we have a really exciting panel here for us I'm sorry, really exciting panel. I'm so excited I can barely talk. Here to really focus on the application of blockchain technology to the fight against climate change. There could not be a bigger challenge that we face as a society even the pandemic, hopefully we'll get past that. Hopefully, in many cases we have gotten past this. All of these crises are interwoven, of course, but the real systemic crisis that we face as a society is figuring out how to manage our presence on this planet and live in coexistence with the planet that we've inherited. And there are a set of organizations and individuals who have been working tirelessly for years now in thinking about how do we use the benefits of blockchain technology to try to build carbon trading markets, try to ease the process of regulation in monitoring and in fighting carbon emissions and other wasteful uses of energy. How might we encourage microgrids? How might we encourage green finance? And so to help us understand this a little bit deeper, I've asked a few of my friends, people who have come together and have been part of the Hyperledger community, and in fact are giving presentations and other parts of the agenda, to have a kind of an open and frank conversation about the potential for the application of this technology to the fight against climate change, the risks of doing that, the limitations of doing that. But let's also let's think big. Let's brainstorm. Let's see where we can go. So with that, if I can get them up on the stage, virtually speaking, of course, and transition and make some intros. Andreas Kind is Siemens Head of Cybersecurity Technology. Welcome, Andreas. Veronica Garcia is the CEO of BitLumens, and Martin Weinstein is a PhD, is the Executive Director of the Open Earth Foundation, as well as the Yale Open Innovation Lab. And he's been co-leading the Hyperledger Climate Action and Accounting Special Interest Group for us since its inception. So Andreas, Veronica, Martin, thank you for joining us. I want us to start, if each of you could spend 2-3 minutes just talking about kind of your background and the role that this technology has played in the work that you do. Why don't we start with Veronica?
Yes, so thank you so much for having me, Ryan. I'm really honored to be here. So at BitLumens, we are actually building a smart meter that is connected to Hyperledger blockchain. And we are doing this for 2 different reasons. One of them is to provide a carbon certificate. So we are running the calculation on the carbon mitigation piece on chain, later on tokenizing it through a layer 2 Ethereum type of XDAI type of blockchain. And then later on, the idea would be to really enter into the marketplace, simply because we believe that the carbon marketplace will grow over time. We just heard that NASDAQ, for instance, had purchased a very important entity from Finland to do carbon trading. And then we bring this type of smart meter into rural communities, mainly in communities that are connected to mini grids, microgrids, or renewable power plants. Okay, and the idea would also be to provide the end user, the person consuming electricity, with a sort of credit score. Okay, a scoring system that it's also running on Hyperledger blockchain. So we have been active since the past 2 years. The smart meter is right now ready, so we will be able to start piloting in India, Mexico, and Bolivia. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
That's fantastic. That's really cool to hear about. Andreas, how does this line up with your work at Siemens? I couldn't think of like 2 more different companies at the ends of the commercial spectrum, perhaps. But I have a sense that you and Veronica probably share a lot of similar views on how much of this will roll out. But what are you doing at Siemens?
That's right. So thanks, Brian, and hi to all of you. I'm in Siemens, in charge of cybersecurity technology. It's a global team that covers cybersecurity technologies really across the spectrum of the enterprise of Siemens, the production part of Siemens, the factories, and the products and solutions that Siemens offers. Before joining Siemens, I was actually with IBM Research in Zurich for quite a long time, 19 years, very much involved in Hyperledger Fabric development. But what brings me here now to Hyperledger Global Forum are actually very concrete industrial problems. And it's three areas. The first one is sort of around machine identities, where we see that the traditional, more centralized way of giving out identities to devices maybe needs to be rethought or extended with more decentralized forms. And the second one is that we feel the trust that we very often talk around ecosystems today. We know business is more and more done in ecosystems. It has to reach into the physical world. And this touches already on the sustainability problem when we talk about carbon footprints, for instance. It has to do with the physical production processes in a factory, for instance. How do you really trust a transaction that eventually makes it into a little piece of the aggregated product carbon footprint? And the third area is really the trustworthiness in sustainability, where we, as Siemens, as a company, feel, of course, much more responsibility coming, but also we see the carbon pricing coming. So that's an area where we have to be at the forefront to address these topics, and it should not be as a kind of PR in a PR way to look environmentally friendly, but it has to be an approach that really is based on a foundation where trustworthiness means more than just a word on a web page or a word from some executives. It has to be based on technology, and that leads to blockchain, leads to maybe more the verifiable credential part of blockchain. I believe there is a lot of potential in order to trace sustainability, trace carbon footprints, trace also any kind of ESG values that are from the problem statement very similar to trace as carbon footprints. That's my quick intro.
That's great. No, it's a very complementary angle to Veronica's. Martin, why don't you tell us about the work that you've done at Yale and that you are planning to do with the Open Earth Foundation?
Great. First, a pleasure to join you all, and in many ways, as nonprofits, both at Yale and at the foundation, our role is also to help integrate all the different parts, the big companies, the small ones, the governments as well, and help bring in a lot of these multi-stakeholders. But the heart of what I've been focusing on is leveraging systems thinking to tackle planetary scale solutions, because the magnitude of the challenge requires that whatever system we design has to be also designed for exponential scale. So we lie at the intersection of emerging digital technology with blockchain and DLTs as one of our tools of choice, but also the power of open source. In many ways, leveraging the Hyperledger tools and other type of tools of the sector, but to concrete applications in the climate space. So to give an example, two things that we're operating at the moment, on one side, in the area of climate action finance, with interoperability of different platforms in the process of securitizing, let's say, solar financing, to be able to streamline that process. On the other side, Open Climate, which is probably our most ambitious project, which is to design and deploy an integrated climate accounting system for the Paris Agreement. And that starts by having consensus in the state of a carbon budget, but also on how we create verifiable climate credentials for individuals, companies, subnational governments, and nations, so that their carbon footprints and inventories can scale up to the international stage of the Paris Agreement. Much to be said there, but my last comment in the intro is, thankfully, I'm not the chair of the Hyperledger Climate Action SIG anymore. After finishing the first year, passed along to amazing new co-chairs, and that really shows when communities start taking off.
Yeah. Thanks, Martin, for that correction. Well, why don't we just dive into the heart of this for a lot of people who are kind of on the outside a bit of blockchain and climate, which is people hear a lot about kind of the negative environmental impact of the use of blockchain technology. And I know those of us on the inside know the distinction between the different technologies, consensus mechanisms, that kind of thing. But how important is it that we actually get a really clear sense of visibility into the ESG burdens that both are embedded inside the financial infrastructure that we're trying to build here, and into the financial assets? I mean, and through that, I mean, how do we actually counter some of these concerns? If we're building new financial infrastructure for energy, financing and accounting and that sort of thing, how do we respond to those concerns that not only the public has, but regulators have as well? Who wants to take that first?
I'm actually going to start, if you don't mind, just because you brought in the dialogue that's been very intense this year around the intensity of blockchains, which is obviously in some sense a misnomer. The heart of it is in the proof of work consensus protocol. And it's the first time I actually think about it. It's actually quite ironic that a technology around traceability and around accounting actually has a really hard time pinpointing exactly where its emissions are coming from, to be able to proper sort of address that from Bitcoin standpoint. But if we take that as a whole, we have there a good example, because miners are consuming electricity. We need to be able to have more visibility of where that's happening, what's the intensity of the grids that they have, which is not as visible as what we'd like to do. Those are also companies that represents the footprint of that company. So if you're an investor on a, let's say, a proof of work mining company, you're probably going to want to know that. And if you would have more traceability on that process, that would trickle into data of the ESG. But then it also, if all of that's worked together properly, it would go all the way to the product level, which is the Bitcoin that a person would hold. So if we would actually use the technology for one of its great uses, we would be able to have a lot more clear transparency at the product and the company level. So taking that into the corporate world, you'd be able to easily translate into how relevant that is for ESG, but pass it along to someone else also to chime in.
Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I will also say something. I think it's important to understand that the new technologies that had emerged over the past years are enabling new type of use cases to tackle climate change and to provide climate disclosures. But these applications, you know, independently on where your data centers are and what type of protocols you are using, are also, we need better also collaboration between public and private entities, in particular for 3 points, right, that are very important for climate change. One of them are investment flows, because we need trillions of dollars of investments to really be able to comply with the Paris Agreement, right? The second one is pricing risks. How can regulators price the risk surrounding climate change? And the third one is accessing data. And when I heard, you know, a lot of financial regulators talking on how can we access data, there is not enough data to be able to align their financial flows with the allocation to SDGs. It's really, to me, interesting because over the past year, we have seen an explosion of data, 5,000% growth, that it's coming mainly from satellite imagery and IoT. And if you combine IoT with things like blockchain, mainly for climate disclosures, and be able to access finance, right? Let's assume a lot of SMEs get together in a conglomerate and they are able to issue a bond on chain. You're reducing the cost of issuance, and that has a huge impact on the community. It has a huge social impact as well if you work, for instance, in rural communities or in the areas that are needed most. And I think traceability of data, transparency and verification will be key to really be able to access the marketplace, in particular the carbon marketplace.
Yeah, traceability of data sounds really important there, but I think also I want to key on that verification kind of phase. How do we trust this data? I was actually reading an article about deep fakes now emerging in satellite data. You can use AI to manufacture satellite data to look like however you'd want it to look like. So Andreas, how does the work that you're doing tie into this? Because I think that question of how do we trust the data that we're collecting and storing into the ledger? You know, it's not. We know that it's not truthful just because it's written to a blockchain, right? Like, how do we get a sense to around trusting this data that is coming from all these different sources?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the domain that we operate, it's almost always a physical domain. It's a train system. It's an energy system. It's a factory, it's a city with the traffic lights. And I think in the past, when you look at supply chain use cases, it was thought that it would be enough to just connect the ERP systems of the different companies in the supply chain to a blockchain. And because they should reflect basically the truth within the company, and then everything would be fine. But it turned out that in many domains, this is surely not enough. You have to extend the trust into the physical domain to make this really sensible, usable, the data that is in the blockchain. You can have it perfectly hashed and chained up, but if the input is just an oracle that comes from an ERP system, it's not enough. So that's the reason why we quite early tried to port the sort of native client parts of the different stacks onto some things like the programmable logic devices. So in factories, when you look at machines that control things, you always have these gray boxes with the blinking LED lights. So they look very old-fashioned, but inside is actually a pretty cool technology. It's a vertical business model, very similar to the iPhone, actually, where everything is like very tightly integrated down to the silicon level. And here we attempt to bring in, or we managed to have some of the agents, so the client parts that you have in Fabric, for instance, ported on. And with this, you know that if a valve opens, the transaction is actually signed at that point, and you can send it off. Or the energy consumption. So if you talk about sustainability, CO2 emissions, we have this differentiation of the different scopes. So the direct emissions, scope 1, the energy, scope 2, and then the supply chain. That's another topic, of course. But if we look just scope 1, scope 2 within a factory context, one trust domain, you really have to track all these kind of events that are somehow triggered by these programmable logic controllers, and bringing the trust into with the respective keys that make sense in the backend of the blockchain network. So it should not be two identity systems. It has to be the same kind of trust domain in order to make it sensible. So that's a big area for us to work on.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question to that, but first let me just mention to the audience, if any of you have questions you'd like me to ask, feel free to ask them inside Hopin, and we'll pull them over. I'll try to pick one. Apologies if I don't get to your question, but feel free to ask, and I'll try to bring it in. Following up on that, and that's really to anybody here, it feels like part of the getting to the question of what is truth, what is trustworthy, what's verifiable, is also partly a question of which data do we decide to put on Ledger and which data kind of sits off Ledger, right? And which is somewhat related to this question of when do we consider using private ledgers and public ledgers too? Does anyone want to kind of touch on kind of the architecture of, at one extreme, things are very public, and that means data is automatically shared, but that's hard to convince companies to completely be public with all their data, versus, but that way you can be transactional about it too, versus how do you just, have a system for verifying timestamps of claims being made and that sort of thing, right? Like, anyone want to talk about that or how they've approached that in the work that they've done?
I could give it a first shot maybe. So I think the general rule for us is to store as little as possible onto a public blockchain. Even in a permission context, we would try to avoid to put any kind of real data onto the chain. Very often, you don't need to. And even if it's encrypted, there's risk that eventually it can be, thinking about post-quantum crypto and so on, it's not completely secure in a couple of years. So we try to avoid, but rather have like a reference that points to something that sits off-chain, or have some form of hashing. Also for reasons that in some cases you want to actually delete a value that has to do with privacy, confidentiality, where things have to eventually move out of your system. If it's there forever chained, you cannot. In the other case, you can. So that's our general rule. Sometimes you cannot avoid it, but I think we try to avoid. And then also going verifiable credentials. Sometimes you want to have a peer-to-peer actually exchange. You don't need this central. It's of course not central, but it's the ledger that is the truth for everybody. So right. It's okay to use verifiable credentials, have underlying the decentralized infrastructure for sharing the schema, the revocation list, and basically the indie kind of approach.
Yeah.
I want to continue a little bit on what we have done in that particular respect. We have also chosen a private type of ledger, simply because we also have a type of software as a service where we have different permissions in the system, right? And so if we have data coming every 5 minutes from thousands of devices, let's call them the smart meters, each of them has a particular ID that we are putting on the chain, right? So it's the UDID. We also identify the houses where we are currently working on chain, but again, we only use 2 different APIs to put that on chain. One is for the carbon mitigation piece, and the other one is for the credit scoring part. So then later on we can share the scores or the result, the outcome, with whoever needs it. But I think it's a pretty flexible way of working around privacy issues and also verification issues, depending on the commands you give to the smart meter, right? So I understand, coming to your later question, I understand what has been tampered in the system and how we can actually verify data because of the commands we have given previously.
Right.
If
right.
I can chime in, you know, a couple of things also there. Andreas was talking about sort of sources of truth, focusing a lot on like physical agents, but a big part of the killer application of DIDs and verifiable credentials is also seen in the interface between government and companies. So, for example, British Columbia has done a great job at practicing a lot of this stuff. And in the process of establishing these trust networks, a verifier for data that has a level of privacy and can access data derivatives, so not the raw data, but trust how the data has been calculated. That also can lead to publishing certain information about that data that needs to be public into, for example, a more public ledger. But it's a lot of that trust and chain of information that becomes very important and available with some of these tools.
It almost sounds like, if I'm hearing folks, if you were to roughly split the use cases between digital identity, and I mean not just companies and individuals, but also the identity of the sensors and that kind of thing, and transactions in terms of trading of carbon credits and other types of almost like tokenization kinds of use cases, but things that are kind of mechanically about traceability. If I were to split these two, it almost sounds like the first one is going to be more important in the fight against climate change for a while, at least in the work that everyone's doing here, than the latter. Is that a fair observation, or am I? Do you think it'll be more even-handed?
I think it's important to be able to have a balanced architecture for both. And this is kind of the hard thing about how to design a properly trusted integrated accounting system, is how do we determine how we all speak about climate in the same way? How do we trust a lot of that data? Because at the end of the day, we're going to have a pressure crunch between the information that's in the atmosphere, that's derived from our sensors and our integrative assessment models, but also what the world's reporting, so that we constantly know how much of a laggard we are as individuals, companies, subnational governments and national governments, and what are the changes that we need to do, and what we said we were going to do, which is also very important to have a level of immutability, because we can go back and say, that's what you said back then, so this is where you're at now. That also allows levels of automation. So I think it's the integrated sort of design that becomes very important, particularly on climate.
Okay.
I want to
Veronica,
say
go for it.
something really quickly about that. I think Martin just touched on a very, very important topic, at least for me personally, because when I hear regulators, talk about all the goals, and at least in Europe, the taxonomy and the reporting that companies would have to do to comply with the Paris Agreement goals or the net zero 2050, it's insane. And then if you can simply take the information coming from satellite imagery, and what is the carbon, the CO2 that it's being released, and the carbon footprint, it's actually very, very simple. So how we can provide this data investor ready. And I think that would be a really interesting use case, and I hope to see more of those use cases in the future.
Okay. Andreas, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a bit around speed as well, that we sort of, in our context, we want to move very fast. Because we feel carbon pricing is coming, we have to be prepared. And if we move into a system that is in a regulatory gray area, or let's say in a difficult area, as Veronica just mentioned, we cannot move as fast. So this is why we focus on what we can actually do with respect to producing a sneaker, a mobile phone, a car, and how to correctly measure it, and also give possibilities to do different sourcing. that you do simulations and you change the design of your product or your purchasing decisions based on this kind of data at hand. So that's our angle. But I understand there's another part. If both comes together, there's even more booster.
Well, there's lots of important work to do. We actually have a Hyperledger lab, thanks to the Climate Action Accounting SIG, focused on bits and pieces of this. Lots more that we could do here. Martin, Veronica, Andreas, thank you for helping give the audience a taste of this. All three of them are doing talks and panels throughout the rest of the event. So please come and dive into that if you are interested in this topic. And with that, I'll close the panel. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for being here with us. And it's really my pleasure to introduce to you all Vitalik Buterin. Thank you, Vitalik, for joining us here for this fireside chat.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So we first met in 2015 in San Francisco on your original roadshow for the Ethereum ICO. And I was really impressed by the vision for the Ethereum ecosystem. And it's one of my greatest regrets in life, not having jumped in with a small bit of investment that day. I admit I was completely daunted by the prospect of what you were building, and I didn't think it was possible. So when we met a year later in Shanghai, it was clear that I was mostly wrong. And in my new role at Hyperledger, I was intent on making sure that we didn't second guess this community being built, even while Hyperledger was set to really explore the more permission side of the blockchain space. These days, I like to think that while we're more full spectrum at Hyperledger with Hyperledger Besu and other efforts that bridge these two worlds, so what we're here to do is talk about the future of Ethereum and how it relates to this thing called the enterprise. But I want to start on these early days. So let me ask, even before Ethereum kicked off, you participated in the early days in the development of the Bitcoin ecosystem and the Bitcoin code base. What was it about those early days of that open source community around Bitcoin that made it so accessible to a young Vitalik?
And I think one of the fascinating things about the Bitcoin community early on is just how it managed to attract and bring together like many very different kinds of people, right? Because like crypto as a whole is itself a very multidisciplinary thing, right? You have the cryptography, you have the math, you have the economics, you have the monetary theory, you have the social and political implications, you have businesses trying to do things with it. And there are definitely many different people, like even back in the community in 2011, that just came at it from all of these different perspectives. Right, and sometimes the perspectives are very different, and there is even some healthy and vigorous debate on the Bitcoin forums back in 2011. This was back before they were even called Bitcoin Talk, and I was interested in a lot of things at the time. Like I've always been interested in math. I've been interested in cryptography. I was interested in economics as well. Also, interested in, I guess, the bigger questions of life and human civilization. So the Bitcoin community definitely had some of all of that, and it was just a great forum to just talk with other people that had all of these different and interesting ideas. And then also there was this just vibrant community of people that was just willing to come in and help and build whatever needed to be built, right? Like we needed to build a Bitcoin client, and there was this community of core developers that was working on and improving the client. We needed to build Bitcoin wallets. People came in and just made wallets, and you needed a way for people to see what's going on in the blockchain. People just came in and built block explorers. So there was this great kind of community collaborative feeling there at the time, which I definitely really like, and that's definitely one of the things that I definitely really value and kind of care about really trying to support in Ethereum as well.
Yeah. Well, sometimes when we in the open source community talk about the community and about how things work, we can sometimes I'm guilty of making it sound like spontaneous combustion. Like these things just happened and we didn't know why or how. But when you think about the Ethereum ecosystem now and like the role that the foundation is playing and others, are there specific things like you think about or that they think about in terms of helping foster the right kind of community around, especially the development, the open source community around the development of Ethereum?
I mean, I think having a good open source community definitely kind of, like there's a lot of different ingredients that I think you need to get right. Like one of them is just that like the ecosystem needs to be one that's kind of open and welcoming, and like if someone wants to come in and contribute, they actually can go do that. Like it's definitely easy to just even accidentally fail at that, and like accidentally just end up either driving away contributors when you don't need to, or just like not making it clear that there's things where people just can go in and participate. Also, I think Ethereum has been kind of successful just because of what it is, right? Like it's not a kind of finite bounded system in the sense of just here's one thing that you can do with it, and like this is money, or this is a domain name system, or like this is one thing. It's an open platform, and people can just go do and like build their own like interesting and amazing things, and just like having that space is also I think important for having an ecosystem that developers are excited about. Yeah. Also, I think there's just like you do have to get the economics right, like, and this is one of the challenges of this community is, right, like especially with crypto, that like on the one hand, well, like I think like the biggest difference I think between like crypto projects and the ecosystem and say the open source ecosystem of the early 2000s is that like there's money involved, and there's like a significant amount of money kind of floating around. You got the coins, and the coins go up, and then the coins go down, and then there's new coins, and then there's new coins going up and down. And on the one hand, like this means that you actually have an opportunity to like try to even pay people, like compensate people who are doing really important work, which I think is important, right? Like you can rely on volunteers for some things, you can rely on volunteers for smaller projects, but the challenge with kind of just relying on volunteers kind of going forever is that, like, first of all, you're not going to necessarily attract enough people, and also like if you have this ecosystem where like some people are contributing for free but then other people are making millions off of it, like that just feels very unfair to people, right? And like that is a legitimate challenge of the crypto space as well, right? That like sometimes you do have this imbalance, and like you make this one valuable tool and like, okay, maybe you can get a grant, but then you make this other thing where like you've come up with a way to stick a coin in the middle of it, and you get like $25 million of VC investment flying at you, and like that's an imbalance, and we've definitely like tried to do our best to address that imbalance, and like at the same time as trying to prevent like the Ethereum Foundation itself from sort of being an overly dominant pull in the ecosystem. So that's also a challenge. Another important challenge is just like appealing to the kind of diverse community. Like, not everyone that might want to contribute speaks English. That's probably the most obvious example. And like just making, our content, documentation, everything is like accessible in different languages, trying to actually engage with all of the local communities is something that we've valued and really tried to do for a long time as well.
Cool. Well, yeah, there's so many different pressures at play, and compared to like the idyllic early days of Apache or Linux or something like that, it sometimes feels like these pressures can really create such an intense kind of pressure cooker environment. Some of those pressures increasingly feel like they might be coming from people trying to adopt these technologies for enterprise uses. I think of the enterprise, I think of Star Trek or whatever as kind of this almost impossibly big or menacing thing, but really some of these are for very prosaic use cases, right? For settlement systems, for regulatory reporting or auditing, that sort of thing. How much are those pressures on the backs of the core Ethereum developers? How much are you thinking about this, especially with the design for Ethereum 2? Were these kinds of use cases and needing to support those use cases on your minds as you were designing the ETH2 design?
Yeah, and I think like enterprise users of blockchains are definitely really important, and I think like the biggest way in which ETH2 in particular can help enterprises is just having more scalability, right? That's because right now transaction fees are high, and one of the challenges with transaction fees being high is that, like, first of all, it just prices out users, but like it prices out different kinds of users differently, right? Like I think the people who get priced out first often are just like, the people that wants to use the blockchain for like doing like non-financial things, like whether it's, supply chain tracking or even things like ENS or like just about everything that's not moving high value crypto tokens around. And so when the fees go up to $10, like, all that's left is like, well, there's some high value domains and then there's like a lot of moving crypto tokens around. And our vision in Ethereum has always been to be this platform that's open to all of these different applications where, the limit is just your creativity. But if in practice, just the economics make it so it's only viable to do a few things, then in some ways that's like a big limitation on how much of our mission we can actually accomplish. So, the dream of scalability, right, is, we have rollups, and rollups already exist for some applications, and now general purpose rollups are coming very soon, right? Like Arbitrum recently released their thing on mainnet, and then Optimism has a kind of limited rollout on mainnet that they've been slowly expanding over time. ZK Sync has been making great progress. Right, and at the same time, we've been working on sharding, which kind of improves the base layer itself, so that at the base layer you have something like 100 times more scalability, right? So sharding times 100, rollup times 100, the two multiply times 10,000, and like the hope is that you can simultaneously like make the platform able to handle more users and like reduce transaction fees, right? And so it's like supply and demand, right? You have more supply, and so you don't have like all of these users kind of bidding against each other so hard. So if transaction fees can go down, then we're hoping by a factor of 100, but we'll see. And then that like opens the door for all of these other applications again. And like there are a lot of people, even in enterprise that even wants to use the public chain, right? Like there's like EY and like the Nightfall, I think it was. There's like the baseline protocol. There's all of these amazing groups trying to like do public chain based enterprise things. And again, I definitely believe in kind of the public chain, I guess, because like I don't even like want to see a future where like enterprise and kind of the people have to be these kind of two different poles that are like are either different universes or kind of viewed as opposing each other. Like we should have an ecosystem where the enterprises and everyone, they can just all live together, and the ecosystems can kind of plug into each other and benefit each other much more. But the challenge is that if you want anyone to be building on the public chain, then the transaction fees have to go down, and then also privacy issues have to be solved, and that's like the other benefit, right? Like you have all of these like very diverse different groups like just building and working on this technology, and like everyone can just use each other's stuff ideally, right? So I'm optimistic about that future.
Good. And you mean it isn't as easy as just increasing the block size by 10x?
No.
Elon said it was, so I thought that was the case. And obviously, one of the big changes coming up in Ethereum too is the move from proof of work to proof of stake, which a lot of people are concerned about the energy consumption of mainnet of cryptocurrencies in general. How much was the environmental concerns on your mind as you were designing 2.0? Is the move largely driven by that, or were there other motivations?
And I think it's definitely a major reason why people wants to move over. I think like the consequences of the amount of like energy and even just stuff that proof of work systems consume are pretty significant, right? Like, and people like often talk about the energy waste aspect, but then there's also like, first of all, even if you're using amazing solar power, like, you're still, which there's not everyone is, like, you're still taking away energy that could be used by other people. And like, we've seen like in Iran, the government's been angry because of like electricity being displaced from local villages and so forth. And then there's hardware, and hardware has its own environmental costs. So going from that to a consensus model where the economics are fully virtualized, which is what proof of stake is, right? Like, we've even talked about like proof of stake validators as being kind of like virtual miners, right? They're like miners, except it's all kind of digital and just simulated by the system, and that just like completely solves all of these problems. So, you know, we don't even have to argue about them, and we don't have to just like get into these lengthy debates of like, you know, who's using coal and who's using solar, and like, is the solar actually solar, and all of this stuff. Like, no, just like make a system where, you know, the resource requirements as a whole are just more than 1,000 times lower. Like, that's definitely I think it's definitely a big motivation for us. I mean, obviously, of course, at the same time, there is kind of the more selfish factor, which is that if you reduce, like, the fact that you need so much electricity and like hardware, like, you also need to pay for that stuff, and to pay for that stuff, you just have to like print a huge number of coins, and that, like, you know, it does risk the economic sustainability of the system. Of kind of you have to choose between, you know, either the supply of coins just kind of continuing to go up nonstop, or between potentially risking security going down to very low levels. And like, once again, you know, at the proof of stake, we don't have that trade-off. So I think, you know, it's good for the Ethereum community, good for the users, good for the world. It's always great when things line up that way.
Yeah, that's great. And just as a wrap-up question, what is the one technology you think in the Ethereum ecosystem as a whole that you're most excited about when you think about the needs of enterprises, or the needs of getting this kind of infrastructure adopted by the mainstream of society?
What kind of infrastructure? I think like some of the higher level stuff that I'm most concerned about. So I think, like, we've talked about privacy, and like, and I've talked about it a lot previously as well, and it's definitely important, right? Like, you know, you don't want Twitter for your bank account, right? And like, the nice thing about like combining blockchains and cryptography is that you have a lot of room to just like make all of these like different compromises between you know, privacy and what your other goals are, and you can kind of much more freely define like what it is you're actually getting. And at the same time, you know, the blockchain has this verifiability and auditability. So, you know, if you like need if you need like, well, whether for an audit or investigation or something, like, prove that, you know, here's things that happened before, and like, look, I did everything the way I was supposed to be doing, like, you can, and you can just kind of selectively reveal whatever information you want, right? Like, so there's a great future for like improving privacy. Security, I think, is also important, right? Like, I still remember and frequently link back to the Bitcoin Magazine article I wrote in 2013. This was like Bitcoin wallet security. And there were these kind of nightmare stories of, you know, a guy has $500,000 of Bitcoin, and then he wakes up and then he doesn't have $500,000 of Bitcoin. What happened? I don't think we know yet. You know, you can hack someone's computer can get lost. If you write the words down on a piece of paper, someone can steal the piece of paper can get lost. You know, there's just all of these things that can happen. And like, I've talked about ideas, like I've talked about things like multi-sig wallets and social recovery wallets and all of these things to try to like reduce the risk that things like that happen, and like actually make like cryptographic keys, or at least kind of blockchain wallets, a more viable way of like authenticating a person. But you know, this is, you know, like, I feel like we've seen fairly big improvements over the last 3 years as well, right? And I feel like, you know, we're gonna continue to see improvements in the future. So, you know, once again, like, it's both, like, for me, a big concern and a worry, but it's also something that I'm like very excited about seeing fixed, because I know it is going to be fixed.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Vitalik. I mean, I'm reminded of the quote from Mahatma Gandhi, which is, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And I see this pattern repeated, whether it's the early days of the internet, people were concerned we can't use it for commercial purposes because it's this research thing and it's unreliable. Then they said that about open source software. You know, and there was that transition point in like the late 90s where it was like, okay, maybe we can use this for enterprises. And I think that's a similar transition point we're at when it comes to thinking about the full spectrum of blockchain technologies. And I think the Ethereum ecosystem is playing a key role in that transition. So thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to talking with you again soon.
No, thank you, Brian, and thank you for just all the great work you've been doing with Hyperledger.
Very sweet, thanks. Great. And now I'd like to transition from talking about the future of Ethereum to the future of digital identity and global travel, where distributed ledgers are set to play a very important role. You all may have heard about how Hyperledger Indy and Aries have been at the core of the self-sovereign identity movement, providing added benefits of privacy, safety, and interoperability to end users. Those benefits are now becoming critical to the deployment of systems for verifying vaccination status and test results, allowing people to once again cross borders safely and quickly. To hear more about this in our closing keynote panel for this segment, we will hear from Marie Massery, Head of Industry Architecture from IATA. She will then have a fireside chat on the topic with Drummond Reed, Chief Trust Officer of Evernym, who has partnered with IATA on the Travel Pass app. So with that, please welcome Marie and Drummond to the stage.
Thank you, Brian, for the introduction. I was thinking for a while how to best explain the topic. And then it turned out that perhaps what I would like to do today is take you through a story that actually goes well before COVID and well before health credentials, because this is where the discussions about blockchain hyperledgers actually started as an opportunity to use the technology. So if we look back in 2019, in IATA, we operate an activity which is called Air Industry Retailing Think Tank, a couple of more think tanks as well. And we look at how we could use technology to solve very specific business problems. And I'm sure that many of you would have traveled before at least the COVID took place. And your experience was not the most seamless one. Generally speaking, we would travel, we would get tickets from one company, we would get train tickets from someone else. We would have all maybe pieces of paper, some of it was on the mobile phone, but definitely not holding together. And if something happened, maybe a bad weather, big flight delays, it has been really, really difficult to put back the experience together. And thinking about it, we have been working with airlines on how we could make the experience much more seamless for the passenger, and how could we actually make sure that the communication between the providers of different services is holding easily together. Now, with that idea, we were thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if I, as a traveler, had in my mobile device literally something like cards that represent individual segments of the journey? I receive them from my providers. Equally, I could have cards that I share with my providers that show, for example, my preferences, or even search for the travel where I would like to go. And I will be the one who will literally control who can share which information with whom. For example, if my flight is delayed, perhaps the airline could help me with reaccommodation based on the preferences in which type of hotel I would like to stay. So all this we imagined as one seamless experience that relies on the possibility of using a mobile device and a wallet in the mobile device. And since it has been in 2019, and in 2019, there was lots of discussions about distributed ledger technology, sovereign. What we imagined is, and if you look on the left-hand side, we called it truly me concept. We would literally factor in those activities that were taking place at that time. How could me as a traveler carry my identity in the wallet? That was the One ID project, and go seamlessly and smoothly through the entire journey, a couple of airports, for example. How could I equally carry my tickets or orders in the same wallet? And we have added the preferences of the traveler, as well as other types of travel experiences, might have been hotel, train. And under this, if this is all on my device, I might carry it on the mobile phone. I might perhaps also have a version of it stored at a part of cloud that I control. I want to be able to communicate directly with those services providers that might be providing me some service. And equally, I want to permission that perhaps even in some cases, the services providers can talk with each other about me on topics that specifically I have allowed that they can happen. And what we needed as a fabric to underline this, we needed some sort of way of identifying each other, authenticating each other, and we imagined that this distributed ledger might be able to do this for us. Now, this all happened in 2019, and early 2020, we started having discussions about perhaps we could build parts of it. Maybe there were also already some trials how we could pilot at least the identity in the wallet. Everyone was motivated to go and try to use the technology. But as you all know, it was early 2020. What happened then? If I fast forward to January 2021, we had a massive drop in the passenger demand because, for good reasons, obviously, the individual governments protected their own countries by limiting the travel. And that had a huge impact on the industry. It was a really huge test of resilience and robustness of the industry. But what happened with that is obviously the governments introduced new requirements. Passengers were asked to show the contact tracing data, for example, to see with whom they might have been in contact. Equally, they may be required today to bring test results, vaccination results, perhaps results or certificates of recovery. And all this in today's travel, where we are at 30% of pre-COVID, because the staff at the airports is required to check all those documents. It increases the waiting time for the passengers. It increases the queue, and fundamentally, it increases the risks when it comes to hygiene, because more people need to group at one place so the documents can be checked. And that in itself has created a huge driver going back to using the same concepts that we were thinking before the crisis, because without any process improvements, if people start traveling in the summer, for example, in Europe, if we imagine getting to something like 75% of pre-COVID, it might be more than 5 hours per trip, in some cases even up to 8 hours per trip in delays of processes just because of checking documentation. So the question is, how could we, all of us, the governments, the airlines, with the passengers, move to digital processes so that we can actually test, we can literally test all the certificates digitally and avoid big queues and potentially chaos at the airports. So from an idea that was very just customer-centric driven, how to improve a journey, we come to an immediate challenge, and that is how to make sure we don't have the papers at the airports. If you look at it from the perspective of the individual parties involved, obviously, what do we need as passengers? We need to know, where can I get tested, what kind of vaccine I might need, and I need to know what are the rules in the individual countries that I might be traveling to, so that I know I can easily travel. Now, while one could easily say, dear passenger, you should know it yourself, obviously the airlines and as transport services providers, they need to be able to share this information with the passengers, because passengers, if they plan for a travel, they expect, yeah, they will also give me that advice. How do I travel? So they need to be able to make sure that passengers know what can be done and how can be done. The governments, on the other hand, if you come and present a certificate, they need to be able to know that it is authentic and that it matches to the person who has been actually, the person who has been tested is the person who travels. And then one of the questions we were trying to resolve is the laboratories themselves, they need to be able to be recognized as someone who actually issued the certificate. So with that, airlines requested IATA to focus on 3 things. It has been, how can we advocate for the global sort of approach? And I will get to details a little bit later, work on the standards, and also try to demonstrate possible solutions that would meet principles that the airlines has set. Because if you look at the problem from the airline perspective, it is not just about reducing the queues or finding a magical solution. It is about solving a problem in a very structured way. If we need to share data about passengers that is deeply personal, it might be health data, there are a couple of very fundamental principles that we have set ourselves. First, and that's a very obvious one, any solution needs to be interoperable, consistent, and scalable, and affordable to implement, because we are in a major crisis. And this is where using technology standards that exist, using open source, comes in as very important factors. The second one is, as I said, it is medical data. That means that we have to make sure that the data stay with the passenger or are exchanged between the passenger and the party who can receive them. And surely, as a transport services provider, I'm not necessarily the one who would need to know exactly what vaccine you had, where were you vaccinated, where were you tested. So the airlines themselves, they should not be involved in collecting the data, but the automation and standardization is absolutely fundamental to avoid the mess. And the last point is, and it's extremely important, remember I started talking about queues at the airports. Anything that we can do, that declarations about health or any travel type declarations can be done before the actual journey, before I arrive at the airports, that helps to smooth the process and helps to avoid the queues. So with these fundamental principles, as I said, airline said, please do help us advocate. That is the traditional role of IATA. Work on standards based on the general technology standards. This is where verifiable credentials, decentralized identifiers come in, and build an example how such solution could work, especially for those situations that perhaps not in every country, the governments may not be ready to put the solutions in place, or it might help to give a good example. So with that, IATA set to build a travel pass, and what I would like to do in just a couple of minutes, give you a very specific example how it works. If we put ourselves into the shoes of the traveler, what I can do is I can take my passport, scan it, or perhaps with character recognition, import it into my wallet. And with that passport, we can create a verifiable credential that carries the passport as a payload, because the passport itself might be digitally signed, but it is a package on its own on the passport. We also might need for the journey to actually have the itinerary where we are going to travel, because then it depends on the rules. Where do I need what documents? So I am set, I have my wallet, I have my identity in the wallet. Comes COVID situation, what do I need? I might need to actually be able to get tests from different labs, and those labs themselves, they need to be recognized and exist in the ecosystem, so that eventually on the receiving side, we can authenticate that the information indeed came from the labs. So one of the options is I might, for example, using decentralized identifiers, peer exchange, identify myself to the lab, receive the lab results. You might know that there are, over the time, number of standards developed how individual states can issue vaccination certificates. So another option is to simply import the vaccination certificate into my wallet. Now, we are at a situation today that we do not have as yet fully working technologies that would allow us to support zero knowledge proof. And as if you remember, I said it's extremely important that the airlines themselves do not have to store the data. So how we address that specific problem, there are services like IATA Thematic that typically consolidate the travel rules. And what this application does is it takes those data elements from the test certificate that are required to check against the rules, but anonymized, and runs the check against Thematic. If I was going on this date using this itinerary to this destination, would this information be enough? the response comes back into the wallet and in itself is created as a verifiable credential. I am okay to travel. And then once I travel, my wallet, because it is travel ready, is capable of sharing specific sets of data with those parties that actually need them. There is no storage outside, everything is on my wallet. Perhaps I might be sharing my okay to travel with the airline, because remember I said the airline doesn't necessarily need to know the certificate itself. It might be that the border control does need to see the original certificate. I might be able to share it with them. And I mean, we started with actually the passport and also the possibility to take a selfie and match it. Perhaps I can also use it to notify the airport in advance I will be coming, so that when I am there, the gate knows this face is coming for this flight, therefore we can open, or based on passenger actually permissioning what information can be shared with whom. So that would be an example of a very specific solution that has been built to a global concept. Now, that concept itself is a part of not just one ecosystem, but if we kind of elevate ourselves, whenever we travel, we have number of interactions with number of different parties. We might get tickets. They are in fact credentials that are provided by the transport providers. We might get passports. They might be credentials coming from the States. We might get the certificates. They are in fact credentials coming from the health facilities. We will all hold them in our wallet. And then we might be able to show them to verifiers who need to know, do we have this type of, can we provide this type of information to be allowed in? That is the business layer. But for this to be able to work, there is a fundamental technology layer set of services that need to be provided to individual services providers. And in those services today, because those original credentials, they might be digitally signed, they might be verifiable in fact, but usually they would not allow selective disclosure, they would not allow zero knowledge proof. The first step that is needed is to take those original credentials, ingest them into wallet, and preferably convert them into a format that actually allows later checking against the rules, zero knowledge proof, provides traceability back to as much as possible to the origin. So there is a need for services to make that conversion. I sometimes call them sort of notary services. Then obviously there is an open playing field for those who actually provide specific wallets. They might be commercial providers. And as we saw in Europe, the states themselves might be providing wallets, especially for identity itself. And then the third type of technology services is how to actually help the verifiers to ask the right questions and ask them in a way that the verifier only receives the right information, but not necessarily the data that they may not need to process. And then for scalability, obviously, if every verifier publishes their own rules, this is where you can travel and these are the rules. Often they are just typed or written in laws, not necessarily machine readable. There is an opportunity for multiple services to consolidate this information, provide the rules, distribute them, make it scalable. And last but not least of those technology services, and I think this is really the one that's important to our discussion, if I travel with my wallet and the wallet is saying, oh, would you like to share this information with this airport? Or maybe I'm a verifier and I need to, someone is presenting me with a test certificate and I need to know, oh, do I trust this lab actually that issued the certificate? There is a need for having a trusted set of services where we can authenticate documents issued by the issuers and we can actually authenticate who is asking me the question, who wants to have this information. And that is trusted service on two levels. One is obviously who are the business parties allowed to ask the questions. And the second one, because we talk about cryptography, where do I find the public keys of those issuers or verifiers so that I could actually authenticate that the questions come really from them. And the very last layer is the governance itself. And as I said in the heading, I would never ever see this as a single ecosystem with a single and certainly not hierarchical governance. There might be individual use cases, and probably will be, where they have a very structured governance and structured hierarchy. But as a traveler, what I do is I travel from one ecosystem to another. I might take a bus, I might take a train, I might take a flight. I need to be able to travel seamlessly through everything. And therefore, what we effectively work on as a problem is how to have a trusted set of frameworks or ecosystems that all work together. And there might be different types of standards. There might be some sort of business level governance, who can do what in which ecosystem. For example, the work of International Civil Aviation Association about deciding how to authenticate individual passports, that would fit in that. But it is also important to rely on general technology standards. And in our case, we have selected decentralized identifiers, verifiable credentials, because individual travelers will definitely travel through different ecosystems. And as I said earlier, even before the COVID, we worked on a concept which was called One ID, how to actually make sure that passengers can go smoothly through multiple destinations, ideally without ever having to pull the passport itself. So from airlines' perspective, this ecosystem needs to be a seamless part of One ID itself. The one thing that I would like to highlight is that as we were working on this, there were a number of questions that came up. And I would perhaps like to put it to you as a technology community, as some of the lessons learned or questions that we would like to see answered. We do have standards emerging, how to issue digital version of I was tested, I was vaccinated, perhaps even the recovery certificate. But as you know, those standards currently, they are signed as entire payload. Therefore, they do not allow selective disclosure. And one of the questions I think we have to look at technically is how could we make sure that we can trust on the original signature rather than introducing some sort of interim signatures, but at the same time support selective disclosure, because the data is really personal and only part of the information should be disclosed. The second question, and that relates perhaps to the first, some of the original setups of the certificates, they do rely on a hierarchical public key infrastructure. And the question is, would we have some possibilities using the Hyperledgers or alternative technologies to safely decouple the information about where is my public key from the information which entity is authorized to issue what? Because surely my own pair of public-private key, I would prefer to generate myself, publish it myself, and I can use it for multiple purposes, perhaps even multiple types of authorizations. And the third one that I wanted to highlight is we are well aware as an industry that decentralized identifiers, verifiable credentials, distributed ledger, they do offer a great potential, but the technologies are new, and there are a number of protocols that have been already deployed for authentication, and some of them already also allow the holder of the identity to be sort of autonomous. So one of the questions is, how can we make sure that we can leverage the technologies that do exist today to speed up the deployment? Now, this was all about health credentials. I'm just getting to my very last slide, because one of the questions that is often being asked is, but all these health credentials for travel, they might go away in September, October next year. If the whole planet is vaccinated, we don't need them anymore. And frankly, if we don't need them, that is a success and no more work is needed, isn't? And with that, I would like to return you back to the original slide I was showing. For the airlines, it is not about just health credentials. It is about discovering the potential of the wallets that the passengers can use to interact with the airlines throughout the journey. They can control the data. They can have the entire contactless travel experience. And if something happens during the journey, they can be in touch with the airline this is why we are doing it. This is why we investing into research. The fact that health credentials came up was just an opportunity to speed up and use the concept. So with that, I would like to stop because I have been talking perhaps even longer than I should have, and I would like to hand over to Dramond, because Dramond surely has many questions for me, and I have at least one for him.
Well, to begin with, thank you very much, Marie. That was a wonderful explanation of the whole trajectory of the development of IATA Travel Pass. And you already actually answered one of my first questions, which was going to be, is it just about dealing with COVID? You've made it very clear that it is, it is only a step in the direction of verifiable credentials for travel and everything they could do. So maybe to give you a little bit of a break, if you have a question for me, you actually posed several of them there in your last couple of slides. Go ahead and shoot that first, and I'll give you a little bit of break and try and give you an answer.
Thank you, Dramond. And I am really itching to ask that because I have on a couple of slides kind of scattered through the use of the hyperledgers. And the reason I have been a little bit brief is at the end of the day, I am a business user, and I wanted to make sure I really leave the opportunity. Dramond, you have been working with IATA on setting up the IATA Travel Pass, and I think it would be a really great opportunity if you could explain to the audience what components, what parts of the Hyperledger were used, where and how.
Absolutely, and it's a pretty straightforward answer at a high level, and then we can spend the whole rest of our time diving deep. We won't do that. But you've consistently mentioned the two open standards that all of this is based on from the W3C, and one of them is the verifiable credential standard, which is going to be 2 years old in 2 months. So it's quite mature out there. The newer one is decentralized identifiers. I'm a co-editor of that spec, and it is just about to go into the final stage and should be finalized in September. And both of those take special advantage of blockchain and distributed ledger technology. And they're two specific projects at Hyperledger that you're building on with Travel Pass and your overall system. At the base layer, you're using the Hyperledger Indy distributed ledger technology, and that is to register the decentralized identifiers that are used by the issuers of those credentials. And you actually use it in I think of it as in 2 stages. They're the health credentials or certificates that you're ingesting, whether it's from the EU COVID digital COVID certificate program, or from the different labs that are issuing tests. Those are all issued as verifiable credentials, and each of those issuers has a DID on Hyperledger Indy-based ledger. The default ledger you're using out of the gate is the Sovereign Ledger. The governance is provided by the Sovereign Foundation, which turns 5 in September. So it's actually one of the most mature technologies out there. And then at the next layer up, where we're talking about the actual exchange of the verifiable credentials, that's using the Hyperledger Aries project for the digital wallets and the exchange protocol for the credentials themselves, for issuing and holding and then verifying those credentials. And you are actually using today the format of those credentials does in fact use zero knowledge proof cryptography for the storage of the individual attributes in the credentials. And it's currently called the Komenisch-Lisenskaya ZKP. And we're moving here, and we'll talk about that in a minute, to BBS Plus as the new ZKP algorithm. But Hyperledger Aries has focused on the incorporation of zero knowledge proof cryptography for all the reasons that you mentioned. So those are the 2 primary projects involved and the 2 areas of the stack. You're actually with IATA Travel Pass and the overall ecosystem you're creating. moving up to what at Trust RP we call layer 4, which is interoperable digital trust ecosystems. And there you're going to be using governance and the ability to reference the different governance frameworks and trust models involved with the credentials and DIDs. So you're really using the whole stack and in a very powerful way.
Thank you, Drummond. That you couldn't have said it better. I really appreciate the explanation, even myself. I was wondering whether we should perhaps between the two of us focus on the kind of tricky question. We have individual states issuing certificates for test vaccine, and they are assigned in the entirety. Basically, I produce a payload, I get my X509 certificate as a government, I sign it, produce it as a data set, goes on a QR code. This is what the passenger might be able to scan into their device. But at the same time, in many countries, for a really good reason, the legislation does not allow technology providers, even transport services providers, to process and read this information. So how can we work, or where are we on the way to work on the standards that we actually do have zero knowledge proof? That would be perhaps the question one from me. And the second one is, how can we retrofit it back so that we trust the source of the original entire certificate?
Is spectacular. And I had, sort of framed that as a question to discuss with you in the fireside chat portion, because I think it's one of the most important things we can do, that is this meeting of the technology capability with policy requirements, right? And one thing that you've emphasized that I hope the audience really understands, which is the need of the airlines and IATA as an industry to say, we want selective disclosure. And to make it clear for anyone that's not clear in the audience, what we're saying is, when I take a credential out of my wallet today and I hold it up for to get on a plane or to get through a border, 100% of the information on that credential is exposed. And in many cases, that's not required, right? They only need to know certain data. And one of the challenges when we share that credential digitally, they actually have a copy of that data. So it's even more dangerous if you're always sharing all the information. So selective disclosure is the ability to cryptographically select only the data the verifier needs. And it actually protects both the privacy of the individual, but it also protects the liability of the verifier, because they don't want data that they have a liability if they're collecting data or seeing data that they're not supposed to. And Marie, you referred to that.
I would perhaps add one more thing to it, that often it is not just the selective disclosure of the data, but it's really all the verifier needs is answer to their question.
Right.
Because, for example, why would I, as a transport service provider, need to know whether you, Drummond, were vaccinated, tested, or whether you had COVID? That, for me, is irrelevant information. All I need to know is whether the documents that you hold meet the rules of the state that set them, and therefore you are ready to go. And I have two options. What IATA Travel Pass does is runs the documents in an anonymized way against the rules and then gives the answer, because we are not yet at zero knowledge proof. And the other option is, and that is happening today, I can also rely on governments that take the responsibility to themselves. Therefore, I facilitate the disclosure of the original certificates to the governments. And then the governments gives me a signal, ideally, again, verifiable credential. And all that signal says, Drummond can come to us, he is welcome, and then you can board the plane.
Which is ideal, because the airlines only get what they need. And the information has only been exposed in that case to the government, that presumably is a safe place to share that information so they can provide that. What you're doing with IATA Travel Pass and your thematic rules engine today is basically saying, show that information, shows what is necessary against the rules for your itinerary, such that we can determine this is what you need. These are the health credentials you need. And if you have them, then you issue the travel pass as a credential back into the wallet, and IATA assigns it, and the airlines will trust IATA's signature. Do I have that right?
Exactly. Yeah, that is the case, but that IATA signature fills in the void of the change of trust. And
Right.
I think that we have to really close that change of trust, because that's much more important than putting new parties in it, be it IATA or any other service provider that suddenly tries to play a part of the business where the trust should simply be end-to-end, and this should be a technology service. I know that we are at the end, so I am absolutely closing. All I wanted to say, Brian, is the very last note. The most important work is the work on the standards between everyone involved on the business side, on the technology side. That's where lots of the work of the Linux Foundation comes in.
Yeah, there's a ton of work going on. This is a conversation I want to just keep having play out, because there's so many important issues embedded in this that it's really important for so many people to know. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Drummond. This has been a great illustration of how deep these issues go and the role that these technologies that we're working on here can go to address this. So now let's pivot to a very short break for 4 minutes. Sorry to squeeze everyone down from that, but I go grab a coffee, do what you got to do. The sessions, the breakout sessions will be starting very soon. So and we will see everyone either at the beginning of segment 2 or back here tomorrow. Thank you so much.